Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the second in a series of mini-lectures on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. Today, we're going to talk about rupture. So I've been saying that in Great Expectations, Dickens is telling a new version of a story as old as the Book of Genesis. In the first scene of the novel, we're already getting clues as to the genealogy of this story, its descent from biblical patterns of narrative. But just as Pip is cut off from the patriline, so too the story seems like a distant and distorted echo of its sacred ancestor. I think this feeling comes through in the restaging of the Akedah, that's the Hebrew name for the binding of Isaac, in the opening pages, as we talked about last time. The scene is eerily familiar but also haunting and strange. The biblical episode is retold as a nightmare, with the figures of the rescuing angel and the knife-bearing father condensed into that of the escaped convict. Following this hint, we may notice that the first chapter closes with an even stranger image. Here are a couple of samples from Guy Green's beautiful cinematography for the 1946 film, followed by the corresponding passage from Dickens. Watching his convict limp away across the marshes, Pip finds his eye drawn to the only two vertical shapes in the horizontal flatness of the landscape. The first is a beacon, the second, a gibbet with some chains hanging to it which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on towards this latter as if he were the pirate come back to life and come down and going back to hook himself up again. Our old friend the OED defines gibbet as an upright post with a projecting arm from which the bodies of criminals were hung in chains or irons after execution. I have a pirate hanging from one in my office. But the OED also tells us that in an older usage, now obsolete, gibbet refers to the cross. Thus, for example, the mid-15th century Mirror of Salvation describes Christ as on the gibbet of the cross, deigning for me to die. If the description of Magwitch threatening Pip evokes the image of Isaac bound for sacrifice, as I've suggested, then this fantasy of a pirate who has come to life after his execution, ready now to hang himself back up on the gibbet, evokes in a still weirder way the iconography of Christ descending from the cross, yet another common motif of religious art. Here's Rembrandt's version. What does this odd mixing of biblical references mean? Why should Magwitch be transformed from Abraham into Jesus, from the Father who performs the sacrifice into the Son who offers himself? It's strange enough that Pip's Abraham is a criminal desperate for food. Why should the figure who evokes Jesus be a pirate? And why, having come to life and descended from the cross, would he be going back to hook himself up again? It all seems nonsensical and yet oddly inevitable, like things in a dream. The religious imagery in this opening scene is so distorted that you might think I'm making it all up, if it weren't for the fact that these events take place on Christmas Eve, and the scene is set in the graveyard of a church. That doesn't mean the story is a Christian allegory, though. But if it isn't, what is it? As you heard last time, I think the opening of Great Expectations is announcing a new covenant. The Christian Bible has done this in its treatment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Christians for centuries have read the story of the crucifixion as a transformation of the binding of Isaac. Now Dickens is seeking to transform the story again. In the book of Genesis, the covenant with Abraham is what modern criticism would call a narrative contract. That is, God promises to make his chosen son the hero of the genealogical storyline, the main trunk of the family tree. Dickens, I believe, is announcing in his fiction a new covenant, a new narrative contract. In this new covenant, he is promising to change how the story of the modern self will be told. And Pip is his chosen son. This break marks Pip as something new in our reading, a character who names himself As the novel opens, we find him standing in that churchyard, puzzling over the tombstones of his father, mother, and 5 younger brothers. There he reads, "Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, is dead and buried." Evidently, he was named after his father. In renaming himself, he moves away from the dead letter of the patronym, the name of the father, which now appears only on a gravestone, like the letters of the law in the Bible, carved, as Corinthians 3:3 tells us, in tables of stone. In this beginning, the birth family has been stripped away, leaving the orphaned and isolated individual free to name himself and tell his own story, free to form his own great expectations in life. Pip is not the patronym, but it does represent the efforts of the infant tongue to pronounce the name of the father, to which it therefore bears an odd relationship of parody or imperfect mimicry. In this way, Pip's name resembles the imagery of the scene, as it mimics the Divine Father's word, the Bible, in a distorted, nearly parodic fashion. If the echoes of the Father's name and the sacred story present in this scene suggest some kind of continuity with the past, this element of distortion must suggest a sense of rupture, of a break with the past that can never be mended. This is the first contradiction of the New Covenant in Dickens. Signs of the past, like the letters on that gravestone, do not connect us to it so much as they emphasize how inaccessible it is. Our efforts to read these signs, to establish some link to the past, only leave us more isolated. And so the modern self in Dickens starts out orphaned in the graveyard of history. This is the sad and absurd predicament of Pip as he tries to decipher the headstones over his family's graves. The whole scene sounds like a travesty of the scenes of reading central to an older generation of novels, like Pride and Prejudice. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character and turn of the inscription, "Also Georgiana, wife of the above," I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. I talked about the different meanings of the word character when we saw Elizabeth Bennet learn to read Darcy by interpreting his letter. Dickens offers us a distorted echo of this process, a little boy in a churchyard creating mental images of his family from the letters carved in stone above their graves. The reading of character here is whimsical and arbitrary, tied in a ridiculous way to the physical shapes of the alphabetical characters and proceeding by way of fantasy. It is pathetic as well, for the little boy clearly yearns for some connection to the family he has lost. His fantasies serve a deep need. The absurdity of his efforts makes them all the more touching. In its sad, comic way, this scene tells us that Pip will never read his way back to the patroline. His efforts only demonstrate how utterly cut off he is from his family and the past they represent. As a character himself, then, Pip takes his origin not from his birth family, who appear rather as his death family, but from the very sense of isolation and alienation that make them inaccessible to him. As a conscious being, he is born out of this rupture with the past. In the striking first lines of the novel, Pip becomes aware of himself as if for the first time, as one feature among many others in a thoroughly inhospitable landscape. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers, growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip. In this passage, Pip comes to know himself as the last and least item in a list that details the identity of things. Pip emerges into consciousness from the surrounding landscape as that bit of the world which thinks and feels and wonders. He is a small bundle marked out by its capacity to shiver, to weep, and to puzzle over the meaning of the rest. This, and not his place in a patriarchal family, is the weird and sorrowful point of origin for his identity. Next time, we'll talk a little more about what I mentioned earlier as Dickens's narrative contract, and we'll see what it means for style and point of view in the novel.